Tow the truck. I don't want that thing anywhere near my building. The rain hammered against the glass towers of Skyline Energy, while employees hurried through the lobby with coffee cups and glowing ID badges hanging from their necks. Headlights reflected across the wet pavement like streaks of silver under the Manhattan night. And parked near the executive entrance sat an old faded Ford pickup that looked painfully out of place beside the rows of black luxury SUVs. The truck's paint was peeling. Rust crawled along the wheel wells. One headlight flickered weakly in the storm. Inside, beneath a pile of blankets, a little girl slept with her cheek pressed against the window while a man in a worn dark jacket leaned forward in the driver's seat, exhausted enough to fall asleep with both hands still wrapped around a cooling cup of gas station coffee. Victoria Hale stepped out of her town car without slowing down. Her heels clicked sharply across the wet concrete as security rushed to hold umbrellas over her. At 38, the CEO of Skyline Energy carried herself like someone who had learned years ago that hesitation looked too much like weakness. She barely glanced toward the truck at first. Then she noticed movement inside. Her expression hardened immediately. "Who authorized that vehicle?" she asked coldly. Security exchanged nervous looks. "We think someone's been staying in it, ma'am." Victoria stopped walking. Rain dripped from the edge of the umbrella beside her. "Outside my executive in trance. No one reported it until tonight." Her jaw tightened. Skyline was hours away from the biggest board meeting in company history. Federal regulators were coming. Investors were already inside. Cameras would arrive by morning. The last thing she needed was a homeless man sleeping outside headquarters. "Tow it," she said flatly. "Right now." Inside the truck, Ethan Cole opened his eyes at the sound of chains clanking against metal. For a second, he looked confused, disoriented from another short night of broken sleep. Then he saw the tow operator backing toward the front tires. "Hey," Ethan called as he pushed the door open into the rain. "Hold on. We're leaving." His voice was calm, tired more than angry. Victoria finally looked directly at him. Tall, early 40s, unshaven, hands rough with grease stains that never fully washed away. Not dangerous, just worn down by life. But all she saw was a problem standing in front of her building. "You can't park here overnight," she said. Ethan glanced back toward the sleeping child in the truck. "My daughter was freezing. I just needed a couple hours before my next service call." Victoria crossed her arms against the cold wind. "This isn't a shelter." The words landed harder than she intended, but she didn't take them back. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Not pleading, not defensive, just quietly measuring the kind of person standing in front of him. Then from inside the truck came a soft, sleepy voice. "Daddy." Little Lily sat up beneath the blanket, rubbing her eyes as flashing amber tow lights reflected across her face. Victoria froze for half a second when she saw the child. Ethan immediately softened. "It's okay, Bug," he said gently. "Just stay warm for me." The tow driver hesitated. "Sir, I gotta move the vehicle." Ethan nodded once. "Yeah, I know." He climbed back into the truck while rain poured harder across the windshield. Victoria turned away and walked toward the lobby without another word. Behind her, the old pickup was slowly pulled backward through the storm, while Lily watched silently through the fogged-up glass, clutching a stuffed rabbit against her chest. 5 minutes later, Victoria entered the 22nd floor boardroom expecting another exhausting night of negotiations. Instead, she walked into panic. Every executive in the room was already on their feet. Screens flashed red across the walls. Cooling grid failure warnings spread across the monitors one after another. Richard Bennett, the white-haired chairman of the board, looked up with genuine fear in his eyes. "Victoria," he said carefully, "please tell me that man outside wasn't Ethan Cole." The room went silent so fast that even the hum of the projector suddenly felt loud. Victoria looked around the boardroom, confused by the panic spreading across faces that normally never showed emotion. "Richard." Bennett pushed his glasses higher on his nose and stared directly at her. "Was that Ethan Cole downstairs?" he asked again, slower this time. Victoria set her tablet on the conference table. "I do not know his name." "What?" No one answered immediately. One of the engineers hurried to the main display and pulled up a digital schematic of Skyline Energy's cooling infrastructure. Red warning indicators pulsed across half the network. At 8:14 tonight, backup stabilization failed across 3 primary sectors. The engineer explained quickly. "We are now operating without a functional emergency architecture." Victoria frowned. Then activate the secondary grid. Another silence. The younger engineer swallowed hard. There is no secondary grid anymore. Richard leaned back heavily in his chair. Because Ethan Cole designed the only working one 15 years ago. Victoria felt irritation rising in her chest. You are telling me our entire infrastructure depends on one consultant from 15 years ago? Not consultant, Richard corrected quietly. Architect. He stood and walked toward the glass wall overlooking Manhattan. Rain streaked down the windows behind him while emergency alerts continued flashing red across the screens. Ethan Cole built the original stabilization framework before Skyline became Skyline. Before investors. Before acquisitions. Before you. Victoria crossed her arms tightly. Then why have I never heard his name? No one wanted to answer that question either. Finally, Daniel Mercer cleared his throat. Because the board forced him out. Victoria turned sharply. Daniel looked uncomfortable for the first time in years. 10 years ago, Ethan warned us the city grid expansion plan would overload low-income districts and create rolling outages during peak demand. He refused to sign off on it. Richard's voice lowered. He was right. Victoria stared at the screen while data continued collapsing line by line. What happened to him? Richard gave a bitter smile. He lost everything. The engineer interrupted again. We estimate 2 hours before total thermal failure. And if that happens? Victoria asked. Lower Manhattan loses power. Hospitals switch to emergency reserve. Federal contracts disappear by morning. The boardroom erupted into overlapping voices. Lawyers talked about liability exposure. Investors demanded contingency plans. Public relations staff were already drafting statements. Through all of it, one sentence repeated in Victoria's mind like an echo. We already had his truck towed. Richard slowly looked back toward her. Victoria, Ethan contacted Skyline 6 weeks ago. Her eyes narrowed. About what? A redesign proposal. He said he found vulnerabilities in the cooling grid. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Security denied him access. Why? Victoria demanded. Daniel hesitated. Because he looked unstable. No fixed address. No corporate affiliation. The room suddenly felt smaller. Colder. Victoria remembered Ethan standing in the rain beside that old truck, water dripping from his hair while he calmly explained that his daughter was freezing. No anger. No begging. Just exhaustion. She looked toward the dark skyline outside the glass windows and felt something unfamiliar pressing into her chest. Guilt. Find him, Richard said firmly. Immediately. Security personnel rushed from the room. Victoria grabbed her coat without thinking. Where was the truck taken? Pier 42 impound lot in Brooklyn. Richard studied her carefully. Victoria, she stopped at the doorway. What? If Ethan refuses to help us. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Victoria stepped into the elevator as thunder rolled across the city above them. For the first time in years, the woman who controlled one of the most powerful energy companies in America felt completely powerless. The rain had slowed to a cold drizzle by the time Victoria pulled into the impound yard near the East River. Rows of damaged cars sat under harsh floodlights while chain-link fences rattled softly in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a ship horn echoed through the harbor. Victoria stepped out of her car and tightened her coat around herself as she searched the lot. Then she saw the old Ford pickup parked near the far corner beside a rusted maintenance shed. One of the tires was half flat now. The truck looked even smaller here, swallowed by shadows and steel fences. She started walking toward it slowly, heels crunching against wet gravel. Inside the truck, a dim yellow light glowed from a battery-powered lantern hanging near the dashboard. Ethan sat sideways in the driver's seat with a toolbox open beside him, while Lily remained curled under blankets in the back. The little heater between them sputtered weakly every few seconds. Ethan had removed part of the casing and was carefully reconnecting wires with numb fingers. Victoria stopped a few feet away and watched quietly for a moment. The strange thing was not how poor the truck looked. It was how carefully everything inside had been arranged. Folded clothes stacked neatly in plastic bins. School books tied together with a red ribbon. A tiny stuffed rabbit sitting beside a child-sized pillow. Survival with dignity. Ethan noticed her reflection in the side mirror before he looked up. His expression barely changed. You found us fast, he said calmly. Victoria glanced around the freezing lot. I need to talk to you. Ethan returned to fixing the heater. Most people only talk to me when something breaks. The words landed harder than she expected. Lily shifted beneath the blankets and blinked awake sleepily. Daddy. Hey, bug. Ethan said softly without looking away from the wiring. Almost got the heater working. Lily noticed Victoria standing outside and immediately sat up straighter. She could not have been older than 8. Pale blonde hair. Oversized winter coat. Eyes too tired for a child. Victoria suddenly remembered herself at that age sitting in the back seat of her mother's car after they lost their apartment. Cold. Quiet. Embarrassed. The memory hit unexpectedly hard. Is she the lady from before? Lily whispered. Ethan paused for half a second. Yeah. Lily looked at Victoria carefully, then offered a tiny polite smile anyway. Hi. Victoria felt strangely unprepared for that kindness. Hello, Lily. Ethan finally got the heater running. Warm air sputtered softly into the cab, and Lily smiled immediately. You fixed it. Temporary fix. Ethan replied with a tired grin. But temporary still? Counts. Victoria watched him for another long moment before speaking again. Skyline's cooling grid is failing. Ethan leaned back slowly in the seat. I figured. You knew? Your company has been patching a structural overload problem for years instead of rebuilding the architecture correctly. Victoria frowned. You warned us. Tried to. Rain tapped softly against the truck roof. Ethan closed the toolbox and rubbed his cold hands together. Look, Ms. Hale, I already know why you are here. Victoria crossed her arms tightly. Then you know how serious this is. Ethan looked past her toward the Manhattan skyline, glowing faintly across the water. I know exactly how serious it is. Then help us. He finally looked directly at her again. Not angry. Not bitter. Just exhausted in a way she suddenly realized had nothing to do with sleep. Do you know what happens when people spend years treating you like you do not belong anywhere? Victoria said nothing. Eventually, Ethan continued quietly. You stop knocking on doors. Lily reached forward from the back seat and gently tugged his sleeve. Daddy. Ethan immediately softened again. It is okay, bug. But Victoria could see something breaking underneath his calm now. Not pride. Trust. And for the first time that night, she realized the real damage she had caused had nothing to do with the truck. Victoria stood beside the truck while cold wind swept through the impound yard, carrying the smell of rain and engine oil from the river docks nearby. For a moment, nobody spoke. The city lights shimmered against puddles beneath their feet, while somewhere behind the fence a train rumbled through Brooklyn. Ethan finally reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a worn metal case no bigger than a briefcase. Scratches covered the surface. One corner had been repaired with duct tape. Lily smiled faintly when she saw it. Daddy's future, she whispered proudly. Ethan gave her a tired look. You were supposed to be asleep. I am trying, she said softly as she pulled the blanket closer around herself. Victoria watched him place the case carefully across his lap before opening the rusted clasps. Inside were stacks of hand-drawn schematics, engineering notes, old flash drives, and pages filled with handwritten calculations. Nothing about them looked careless. Every line was precise, intentional. Years of work sitting inside a dented box in the back seat of a truck. Victoria slowly stepped closer despite herself. Ethan flipped through several pages before stopping at a complex grid layout covered in red and blue markings. Your cooling system overloads during high-demand redistribution because the transfer sequence loops backward under emergency pressure, he explained calmly. You are forcing the grid to stabilize itself after the spike instead of before it. Victoria stared down at the diagrams. Our engineers never found that. Ethan gave a quiet, humorless smile. Because they kept patching symptoms instead of rebuilding the structure. She looked at him differently now. Not as a homeless mechanic. Not as a man sleeping in a truck. But as someone who saw things everyone else had missed. Can you fix it? She asked carefully. Ethan rested his hands on the metal case for a moment without answering. Probably. Probably is enough right now. He looked toward Lily again. The child had already drifted halfway back to sleep beneath the weak heater glow. Ethan lowered his voice. You know what the funny part is? Victoria remained silent. 10 years ago, your company said my ideas were too expensive because they protected neighborhoods that did not generate enough profit. His jaw tightened slightly. Now those same protections are the only thing standing between Skyline and total collapse. Victoria felt heat rising in her face despite the freezing night air. She had spent years defending Skyline's reputation, expanding it, protecting it. But standing here beside that truck, she suddenly realized she had inherited more than a company. She had inherited its mistakes too. Ethan carefully closed the metal case again. I sent Skyline 3 redesigned models over the last 5 years, he continued quietly. No response. No meeting. Nothing. Victoria frowned. Why keep trying? He looked out across the dark water beyond the fence. Because millions of people depend on that grid whether the board cares or not. The answer hit harder than she expected. Most executives she knew talked endlessly about leadership while chasing stock prices and magazine covers. But this man, sitting in a freezing truck with barely enough money to survive, still cared more about strangers losing power than about his own anger. Victoria swallowed slowly. Ethan, I made a mistake tonight. He gave a faint, tired laugh. Tonight was not the first mistake Skyline made. She accepted that without defending herself. For the first time in years, Victoria Hale had no prepared answer. No polished corporate response. Only regret. Then suddenly her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and immediately answered. Richard Bennett's voice came through sharp with panic. Victoria, we just lost Sector 7. We are officially in emergency countdown. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as if he already expected it. How long? Victoria asked. 90 minutes before cascading failure. Silence settled over the truck again. Then Lily stirred sleepily beneath the blankets and looked at her father with innocent certainty. You are going to help them, right, Daddy? Ethan looked down at his daughter for a long moment while rain tapped softly against the roof above them. Ethan stared at Lily for several quiet seconds while the weak heater hummed softly between them. Her small hands clutched the stuffed rabbit against her chest, and despite the freezing night around them, she still looked at him like he could fix anything in the world. That expression alone seemed to break whatever resistance he still had left. He let out a slow breath and rubbed a hand across his tired face. You always make this hard, he murmured gently. Lily smiled sleepily. Because you are the good guy. Victoria looked away for a second after hearing that. Something about the simplicity of a child's faith felt heavier than all the pressure waiting back at Skyline Tower. Ethan reached for the ignition and turned the key once. The old truck groaned loudly before finally sputtering to life. The heater dies if we stop too long, he explained calmly while adjusting the vents toward Lily. Victoria stepped back as the headlights flickered across the wet pavement. You are coming? Ethan nodded once. I am not doing it for the board. I know. He looked directly at her through the open window. I am doing it because if that grid collapses tonight, regular people suffer first. The words hit her harder than any accusation could have. 20 minutes later, the pickup rolled into the underground parking structure beneath Skyline Energy. Employees stopped walking when they saw it. Some recognized Ethan immediately. Others only stared in confusion at the rusty truck moving slowly between luxury sedans and executive vehicles worth more than most apartments in Brooklyn. Victoria walked beside the truck instead of ahead of it. That detail alone caused whispers to spread through the garage. By the time they reached the private elevator, Richard Bennett and several engineers were already waiting downstairs. Richard stepped forward first. Ethan. Ethan gave a short nod. Richard. The older man looked genuinely ashamed. I should have listened to you years ago. Ethan shrugged faintly. Most people with power only listen after things break. Nobody argued with that. They entered the elevator together while emergency notifications flashed across every screen inside the building. Sector 8 unstable. Redistribution failure escalating. Estimated overload in 73 minutes. Lily leaned quietly against Ethan's side, holding the stuffed rabbit, while Victoria watched the numbers climb higher with every passing second. The boardroom they entered no longer looked powerful. It looked frightened. Executives who normally spoke with polished confidence now stood around the screens whispering anxiously, while analysts rushed between tables carrying reports. The moment Ethan walked in, the room changed. Conversations stopped. Several people visibly recognized him. Daniel Mercer straightened uncomfortably near the far wall. Ethan noticed him immediately, but said nothing. Victoria stepped forward. Show him everything. One engineer hurried to pull up the active system map. Ethan studied the display silently for less than 30 seconds before speaking. You rerouted pressure through the Manhattan South. Exchange. We had no choice. The engineer replied nervously. Ethan shook his head once. That exchange cannot sustain emergency cycling above 40%. The engineer swallowed hard. It is already at 62. Ethan reached for the keyboard himself and began typing rapidly. Then you have less than an hour before thermal cascade. The room fell silent again. Victoria watched him closely now. Calm, focused, certain. No ego, no performance, just competence. Ethan enlarged the grid layout and pointed toward a narrow section near the East River corridor. Your only chance is isolating the cooling loops before redistribution spikes. Daniel frowned immediately. That could shut down financial sectors temporarily. Ethan looked at him coldly for the first time all night. Would you rather shut down hospitals permanently? Daniel said nothing after that. Victoria noticed several engineers quietly exchange relieved looks as Ethan continued working. For the first time in hours, someone in the room sounded like they actually understood the disaster unfolding around them. Lily climbed carefully into one of the large leather chairs near the wall and watched her father with sleepy admiration. Daddy fixes things, she whispered softly to herself. Victoria heard it anyway. And standing there beneath the cold white lights of the boardroom, surrounded by fear, money, and collapsing systems, she realized the smallest voice in the room had just said the truest thing of all. The next 40 minutes felt like the entire building had forgotten how to breathe. Emergency alarms pulsed softly through Skyline Tower while rain continued streaking down the massive glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Ethan stood at the center of the boardroom surrounded by engineers twice as young as him. Yet every eye remained fixed on his screen. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard while lines of system code and infrastructure maps shifted rapidly under the harsh white lights. Redirect pressure through the North Brooklyn Reserve Line, he said calmly. Now, one of the engineers hesitated. That line has not been active in 6 years. Ethan did not even look up. Then tonight would be a good time to remember how it works. The engineer immediately rushed to follow the instruction. Victoria stood near the back of the room, watching him closely. The strange thing was not how intelligent Ethan was. It was how calm he stayed while everyone else panicked. The boardroom that normally worshipped control had completely lost it. But Ethan never raised his voice once. He simply kept solving one problem after another like a man repairing a machine in his garage, instead of trying to prevent a citywide disaster. Lily had fallen asleep curled sideways in the leather chair with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. At some point, Victoria quietly placed her own coat over the child without saying anything. Richard Bennett noticed, but did not comment. Sector 8 stabilizing, one analyst suddenly called out. Heads lifted immediately around the room. Another voice followed seconds later. Cooling pressure dropping across lower Manhattan. Relief swept through the engineers like air finally returning to a suffocating room. Daniel Mercer stepped forward cautiously. Can the system hold? Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, exhausted eyes still fixed on the monitors. If nobody touches anything I fixed tonight, maybe. Daniel forced a weak smile. You always did enjoy making us look incompetent. Ethan finally looked at him directly. You handled that fine without my help. Silence fell again. Victoria noticed the tension immediately. Years of boardroom politics had taught her how to recognize old wounds hiding beneath polite conversations. Richard slowly removed his glasses. Ethan, he paused carefully. You should know something. Ethan already looked tired of hearing apologies. Richard, no. You deserve the truth. The older man glanced toward Victoria before continuing. 10 years ago, Ethan refused to approve the expansion model because it would overload low-income districts during peak winter demand. He tried to stop us. Victoria frowned slightly. You told me he resigned after contract disputes. Richard looked ashamed. That was the public version. Ethan closed his eyes briefly like he had no interest reopening old scars. But Richard continued anyway. The truth is, the board buried his reports because delaying expansion would have cost billions. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. You ignored a known failure risk. Daniel spoke defensively from across the room. The projections were theoretical at the time. Ethan gave a faint, tired laugh. Tell that to the neighborhoods that lost heat every winter afterward. Nobody answered him. Victoria suddenly understood why Ethan had looked at Skyline with such disappointment long before she ever arrived. The company she spent years protecting had once destroyed the very man who built its foundation. She looked toward Ethan again. Worn jacket, exhausted face, hands rough from years of labor. Yet somehow he still came back to save them anyway. Not because they deserved it, but because innocent people depended on the outcome. Victoria felt something shift quietly inside her then. Respect first, then something deeper she could not fully name yet. One of the engineers suddenly smiled in disbelief at his monitor. We did it. Several screens across the room turned from flashing red to steady green. Applause broke out instinctively among the staff. Some actually laughed from relief. But Ethan did not celebrate. He simply leaned forward slowly and rested both hands against the table as exhaustion finally caught up with him. Victoria moved toward him before she even realized she was doing it. Ethan, he looked up at her quietly. For the first time all night, the fear was gone from the building. And somehow, that made the silence between them feel even heavier. Most of the engineers left the boardroom slowly after midnight, their exhausted faces softened by relief and disbelief. Skyline Tower no longer felt like a machine on the edge of collapse. The alarms had stopped. The screens glowed steady green. Outside the windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath rain-soaked streets and drifting fog rising from the river. Ethan remained seated near the central monitor with one hand resting against his forehead, while Lily continued sleeping under Victoria's coat. The child had not moved in nearly an hour. Richard Bennett quietly approached Ethan carrying 2 cups of coffee from the executive lounge. Still terrible coffee after all these years, Richard admitted as he handed him one. Ethan gave a faint smile before taking it. Some things survive every corporate restructuring. Richard nodded softly, but the humor faded quickly from his expression. I owe you more than an apology. Ethan stared down into the coffee for a moment. Richard, I stopped needing apologies a long time ago. That does not mean you did not deserve one. Ethan said nothing. Across the room, Victoria stood alone beside the glass windows overlooking the city below. For the first time in years, she was not thinking about quarterly earnings or investor pressure or media strategy. She was thinking about a little girl sleeping peacefully in a chair because a man who had every reason to walk away still chose to help strangers instead. The realization unsettled her more than the crisis itself. Daniel Mercer suddenly entered the room, carrying several printed reports. His expensive suit still looked perfect despite the chaos of the night. Federal regulators confirmed stabilization, he announced. Markets open normally in the morning. Richard nodded once. Good. Daniel glanced toward Ethan carefully. The board would like to discuss compensation. Ethan looked almost amused by that. Compensation. Daniel shifted awkwardly. You prevented a catastrophic failure tonight. Ethan leaned back slowly in the chair. Interesting how quickly expertise becomes valuable once rich people start panicking. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Victoria finally stepped away from the windows. That is enough. Daniel looked surprised by the sharpness in her voice. Victoria crossed the room calmly until she stood beside Ethan's chair. He is not wrong. Silence followed immediately. Daniel lowered his eyes first. Ethan studied Victoria carefully then, like he was trying to understand whether the woman standing here was the same one who ordered his truck removed only hours earlier. Maybe she was trying to understand that herself. Lily stirred softly in her sleep, and the stuffed rabbit slipped onto the floor. Victoria bent down instinctively to pick it up. The rabbit was old and worn at the seams, one ear loosely stitched back together by hand. She noticed faded marker writing near the fabric tag. Lily Cole, property of Daddy's mechanic shop. Something tightened painfully in her chest at the sight of it. She carries this everywhere. Victoria asked quietly as she handed it back. Ethan nodded. My wife gave it to her before she passed. Victoria looked at him carefully. I am sorry. Ethan's expression softened for the first time all night, but only slightly. Cancer, he said quietly. 3 years ago. The room fell still again. Victoria suddenly understood the exhaustion in his eyes in a completely different way now. Not weakness. Grief carried for too long without rest. Ethan glanced toward Lily. After that, everything just kept getting smaller. The house, the work, the future. His voice remained calm, but Victoria could hear how much strength it took to say even that much. But she never stopped believing in me. He looked toward the sleeping child with quiet pride. Kids are strange like that. Victoria felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her throat. She had spent years surrounded by ambitious adults who measured people by status, influence, and money. Yet somehow the most genuine thing she had seen in years was an exhausted father in a worn jacket protecting hope inside a little girl. Richard suddenly checked his watch and exhaled deeply. It is almost 2 in the morning. Ethan immediately stood. Then Lily needs a real bed. Victoria looked at him. You are not going back to that truck tonight. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Victoria interrupted softly. Please. And for the first time since she met him, her voice no longer sounded like an order. Victoria drove them herself. The rain had finally stopped by the time the black sedan rolled through the empty Manhattan streets just after 2:30 in the morning. City lights reflected across the windshield while soft jazz played quietly through the speakers, low enough that Lily continued sleeping peacefully against Ethan's shoulder in the back seat. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Ethan watched the city pass outside the window with the distant expression of someone who had spent years moving through life without expecting comfort anymore. Victoria kept both hands on the wheel, though her thoughts remained fixed on the man sitting behind her. She had met billionaires, politicians, celebrities, founders worshipped by magazines and television networks. Yet none of them had stayed in a collapsing boardroom for hours simply because strangers might lose heat in winter. There is a hotel connected to Skyline Tower, Victoria finally said quietly. You and Lily can stay there as long as you need. Ethan looked up slightly. That is not necessary. It is. We will be fine. Victoria tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Ethan, a child should not sleep in a truck during December. Silence settled again after that. Not hostile, just honest. Ethan looked down toward Lily, carefully adjusting the blanket around her shoulders before speaking again. You know what the worst part is? Victoria glanced at him through the rearview mirror. People think poverty always looks loud, angry, dangerous. His voice remained calm and steady. Most of the time it just looks tired. The words stayed with her all the way to the hotel. When they arrived, the night manager nearly dropped his tablet after recognizing Victoria Hale walking through the lobby beside a man in work boots carrying a sleeping child. Staff immediately rushed forward offering assistance, but Victoria quietly waved them back. I will handle it. Ethan noticed the reactions around them, and his shoulders stiffened slightly. Victoria noticed that too. Relax, she said softly while pressing the elevator button. Nobody here is going to disrespect you. Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. You sure about that? The elevator doors closed before she could answer. Upstairs, Victoria opened the door to one of Skyline's executive suites. Warm light spilled across polished hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Lily slowly opened her eyes as Ethan carried her inside. For a second, the little girl looked completely confused by the enormous suite around her. Whoa, she whispered sleepily. Victoria smiled despite herself. You like it? Lily nodded slowly. It looks like one of those fancy apartments in Christmas movies. Ethan carefully set her down on the couch. Do not get too comfortable, bug. Victoria looked at him immediately. Why would you say that? Ethan met her gaze quietly. Because temporary things hurt less when you do not pretend they are permanent. The sadness behind that sentence landed heavily in the room. Victoria suddenly realized how many times life must have forced him to leave places behind. Homes, jobs, stability, maybe even hope itself. Lily wandered slowly toward the giant windows overlooking Manhattan. Daddy, she whispered softly. You can see the whole city from here. Ethan walked over beside her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Victoria watched the reflection of the two of them against the glass. Father and daughter standing side by side above the glowing city they had spent years surviving beneath. Something about the image caught painfully in her chest. There is food in the kitchen, Victoria said quietly, and fresh clothes can be delivered in the morning. Ethan turned toward her slowly. Why are you doing this? The question was direct, honest. Victoria opened her mouth, then stopped. The truth surprised even her. Because tonight I finally realized something. Ethan waited silently. Victoria looked toward Lily standing at the window. A company is not successful because of the people sitting in the boardroom. Her eyes returned to his. It survives because of people like you. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she met him, the wall between them seemed to lower just slightly. 6 months later, the first snowfall of December drifted softly across Manhattan, while warm lights glowed inside Skyline Energy's newly renovated Community Innovation Center downtown. The building used to be an abandoned distribution warehouse near the river. Now colorful banners hung across the entrance beside a polished steel sign that read the Coal Initiative. Employees, reporters, engineers, and dozens of working families filled the lobby carrying coffee cups and winter coats, while children ran between interactive science displays designed by Skyline volunteers. Near the center stage stood Ethan Cole in a dark navy suit that still felt unfamiliar on his shoulders. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve awkwardly while Lily tugged excitedly on his hand. "Daddy, come look," she whispered eagerly. "They used my drawing." Ethan followed her toward the far wall, where a framed sketch hung beneath soft lights. It showed a little pickup truck parked beneath a city skyline, with yellow windows glowing warmly above it. At the bottom, written carefully in childish handwriting, were the words, "My dad builds things that protect people." Ethan stared at the drawing quietly for several seconds. Then he smiled in a way Victoria had never seen before that night in the impound yard. Lighter somehow, like life finally loosened its grip around his chest. "Miss Hale says everybody stops to look at it," Lily whispered proudly. "I can see why." Ethan turned as Victoria approached across the crowded room. She wore a simple ivory coat instead of her usual executive black, and for the first time since he met her, she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman finally comfortable being human again. "You are late," Ethan said softly. Victoria handed Lily a small paper bag with a smile. "I had to stop for hot chocolate." Lily immediately brightened. "With marshmallows?" "Extra marshmallows." Lily hugged the bag dramatically against her chest before racing toward the refreshment table with several other children. Ethan watched her go with quiet affection. Victoria stood beside him looking out over the crowded center. 300 families enrolled already," she said softly. "Housing assistance, childcare support, retraining programs." Ethan nodded slowly. "You actually did it." Victoria glanced at him. "You are the one who made me realize what Skyline was supposed to be." Ethan shook his head faintly. "No, you changed it." A comfortable silence settled between them while snow drifted gently outside the tall windows. Across the room, Richard Bennett laughed with several engineers while young interns demonstrated new sustainable energy models built from Ethan's redesigned infrastructure system. Skyline stock had recovered months ago, but somehow that no longer seemed like the most important victory. Victoria looked toward the framed sketch again. "Do you remember what you said that night?" Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "I said a lot of things that night. You said people stop knocking on doors when they spend too long feeling unwanted." Ethan looked down quietly for a moment. "Yeah." Victoria stepped a little closer beside him. "I'm glad you knocked on ours anyway." He met her eyes then, and the warmth between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt earned. Slowly, carefully, Victoria reached for his hand. Ethan looked surprised for only half a second before gently holding hers back. No cameras, no board members, no speeches. Just two exhausted people who found something honest after years of carrying too much alone. A sudden cheer erupted across the room as Lily climbed onto the small presentation stage holding her cup of hot chocolate proudly. "Everybody," she announced loudly into the microphone, "this is my dad." The room immediately quieted with smiling curiosity. Lily pointed directly toward Ethan. "He fixes things nobody else can fix." Laughter and applause filled the center while Ethan rubbed a hand awkwardly against the back of his neck. Victoria laughed softly beside him. "She definitely got your confidence." Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off Lily. "No," he said quietly. "She got her mother's." Snow continued falling outside while warm lights spilled across the crowded room, and somewhere deep inside Skyline Energy, the same company that once pushed Ethan Cole into the cold had finally become the kind of place worthy of the man who saved it.